Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 194, and we're going to talk about white culture. Yeah. I know I'm not white, uh, but some people have called me a banana, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. So I think I have a little bit of insight. Just kidding. Anyway, oh, what a rough day at middle school. I tell you, sixth graders, they can really drive you to the edge, to the edge. I miss teaching at the college level. But anyway, so let's also make note that there's a lot of election stuff going on, but we're doomed. And so I don't really feel like talking about it. Also, there's talk about our insane foreign policy, about the possibility of giving the green light to Ukraine to shoot off some long range missiles to hit Moscow. And of course, the missiles are supplied by the UK and the US. And as some people have said, since the UK has, since Ukraine has no one to operate those batteries, of course, it's English and American soldiers who are operating those systems. But anyway, I'm not sure what I saw on Twitter. It's something earlier today between classes, and it was a reference to white culture. And I've seen lots of these sort of video clips where people say, "What do you notice?" Or "What's missing?" Or "What do you see?" That kind of video presentation. And so people are therefore tangentially talking about Black culture, right? So is there such a thing as white culture or Black culture? Now, when people present these videos, obviously it's without commentary. And so it's sort of like finding a word you don't know. So you try to figure out the meaning through the context. So basically, you're essentially inventing, probably not the precise, but trying to come up with an explanation that also fits your preconceived notions of what you're observing. So there's a lot of skewing going on. So, as I said, when people try to explain white culture, and it's not just average, everyday, non PhD people who do this, but it's PhD people who do this as well. And I'll get into that in a moment. But people try to explain quote unquote white culture through examples. And if you know anything about Socrates' dialogues, it would never pass the sniff test, right? He would say, "You're just giving me examples, give me a definition." And a definition is really lacking when it comes to describing white culture. And give it a try, and you'll realize that you'll fall flat on your face if you're serious about doing it. And when people do come up with or present certain examples, they do so in a way to present something or to paint something as generally good or generally bad. So let's address this question of white culture. And I got to say, it's a weird question. It's not just, oh, a racist question or whatever, how people are portraying it these days, but it's an odd question, right? Because you're making the assumption that a skin color has culture. So if you go back to my understanding of race, that is a generalization or a categorization based on a single identifiable characteristic. So when we're talking about white culture, it's like, what's the culture of the color white, right? It's a weird thing. And maybe because you have these preconceived notions, it's kind of hard to make headway with that argument. So I'm going to make a comparison. I'm going to try to explain it by using yellow culture, aka Asian culture, right? So what a lot of people, when they say Asian culture, really what they're talking about is yellow people, right? So you got black, white, and yellow, right? Bring back the old color scheme that I learned, um, you know, 50 years, 55 years ago or so. People told me that the races of the world, you got your Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, right? So the three color system was what a lot of people learned back in the day. So yellow culture, what are we talking about here? So I'm going to use Asian culture as a way of trying to understand white culture. I hope you understand what I'm trying to do here because it's kind of difficult to if you just jump into white culture. Now, the thing is, the reality is that culture comes from the people who live in a very specific area. But Asia is really huge and diverse, right? You're talking, depending on where you want to draw the line, but it can be some of the Aleutian Islands off of Alaska, all the way to Turkey, right? And so Russia is always this weird, okay, do we make them Asians or do we make them Europeans, right? And so people are always kind of weird about that. But it's kind of odd because most of Russia is sitting in Asia, but we won't talk about that, right? We'll just sort of kind of let that slide. So Asia is extremely diverse. I mean, to think that Japanese people are the same as Cambodians, are the same as people from Turkey, are the same as the people from Israel, it's just kind of weird, right? People generally don't think that way. When you say something like Asia, you're going to instantly bring to mind Asians that you know, and usually just one or two of them. So you're comfortable with the category if you're only thinking about one or two people. But if you're sitting in a room full of Asians that are from all of the continent of Asia, then you realize that it is quite diverse. And the landmass is huge, right? And sometimes people will include Pacific Islanders, right? Or even Native Americans, right? Because Native Americans in North and South America, they originally came from Asia. And if you watch Kon-Tiki, then you know that all of the Polynesian islands in the Pacific were populated from people traveling out from South America. Okay. So one might want to include them as well in a weird kind of way. So, first of all, we have to realize that Asian culture is really diverse. And that's what really bothers me when people talk about Asian Heritage Month. It's like, seriously? So, you're going to take something that massively huge and you're going to serve a couple dishes. You're going to have a couple of people come in with their traditional clothing. And this is supposed to be representative of all of Asia? Really? And I think I mentioned it a few episodes ago that my kids' school they had Asian Heritage Month, and so they made this presentation to the school board of all the stuff they did. And in my head, I was like, yeah, that's like a small sampling of Asia, and by making it seem like you're doing a fair representation of Asia, really you're creating a caricature. Right. I myself am always surprised, and when I hear about a different subgroup within Asia with these totally different practices, totally different culture that I never even heard of before, right? Especially when you go into Mongolia or the former Soviet Union satellite states, there are a lot of interesting things which I've never even heard of, but none of that is generally represented or even discussed when it comes to Asian Heritage Month. Now, what culture actually is, and I got this from my dad. He wrote an article, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, and I really liked it. He wrote it in Korean, and but I used it in all my classes, obviously not the Korean version, but I translated parts of it, and basically culture is just codified habits. So in a small region, they did things in a certain way and it made sense to do it that way. Other people saw it and they didn't have a better alternative, and so everyone just started doing that. So for example, if you've been working out in the fields and you're handling cow manure all of the time as fertilizer, but now it's time to eat. So you don't want to touch the food, right? Because washing your hands was not something that was necessarily convenient. Even if you did wash your hands, you don't want to touch your food with hands that have been handling cow manure all day. So you use chopsticks. So, hey, that makes sense. I won't use my fingers. I'll use these these sticks, and we'll call them chopsticks. You know, or at least in English, there's chopsticks, obviously, because in Asian society they use different words. Okay. And so eventually everyone's like, hey, that's a great idea. How do you hold it? How are you using it? Okay, let's all do that. I'll teach my kids how to do that. And all of a sudden we have culture. So culture is just basically codified habits. And so that kind of helps us to understand what happens when one culture encounters another. There's a period of negotiation of habits, right? Cultural conflict, which is very similar to generational conflict, right? Older generation, younger generation in the United States, right? So the adults versus the children, they have a trouble understanding each other. So you have generational misunderstanding and conflict. Well, that's kind of what cultural conflict is. Each demographic has their set of habits. This is the way we do things. And so traditionalists or conservatives will try to hold on to the old ways. They see all this neat, uh, I don't know, what do you call it? Some kind of mystique or maybe even some value in maintaining the old ways. And this includes language. Okay. And I won't get into language here, uh, but language is also it is indicative of the people who speak it, right? So within the language itself are a lot of the cultural values, and I've talked about this before. You know, the difference in the vocabulary between an egalitarian society versus a hierarchical society, it's there in the language. And so by speaking the language you are preserving culture, right? But when we that's language. And so if we just focus on behavior, traditionalists want to, or conservatives want to remember and hold on to the old ways. Now, liberals are those who look at the other cultures and say, hey, you know, that's better. You know, so forget this tradition. This stuff is easier, it's more efficient. And so I'm going to do it like that. Right. And so this is the clash. You have people who want to continue the more expensive old ways, and you have liberals who are like, no, no, it's a lot easier just simply to do it like this. So if we want to talk about white culture, then you have to introduce another descriptive adjective, right? Like German Heritage Week, right? No one ever says white German Heritage Week, right? It's German Heritage Week, or you know, Dutch heritage, or Italian heritage, or Greek heritage, right? But we're not using the word white. But once we do the ethnicity thing, then you realize, you are reminded that you know, culture is a regional thing, right? So in this area, we have deemed over the years that this is the best way to eat our food. These are the best foods to eat, et cetera, et cetera. And that becomes our culture. So what's commonly referred to then as white culture is just simply the set of behaviors which work best in this society, which we call the United States of America. You know, but even that, even though that itself is extremely broad, okay, but white culture itself is a hodgepodge of all of these different so-called white societies, right? Where the skin color is what a lot of people today consider white. And if you know the history of whiteness, then you know that originally it was just Northwest Europe was considered white. And so the Mediterranean European countries were, you know, considered not white until they started getting outnumbered by Asians. And so they were like expanding the white classification. But nevertheless, you know, what now people consider white people, right? Uh, it's just a hodgepodge of all of these different behaviors, the results of all of the cultural negotiations that took place here in the United States. Now, what was the governing principle here in the United States? Well, it was freedom with responsibility. So, in a free society where you had to take responsibility for your actions, a lot of the old traditional conservative cultural practices dropped out, right? It was just too costly to maintain. And so people then would gravitate to, you know, embracing something else that someone else had come up with, which seemed to work better. And so, in this free society, what turned out to be a very common value cultural practice was working hard, right? Before the era of welfare and big government, you had to work hard. And it wasn't necessarily even about, getting an education, right? Going to school, going to college. It wasn't nothing, it wasn't about that. It was about working hard. It wasn't about your political connections. That wasn't really about your athletic skill. It was about working hard. And so once you focus on that basic value, from there, people brought, you have leftover practices from their previous ethnicities, right? And so you'll have different dishes, you'll have different expressions, different phrases, different dances, different dress, different holidays, different accents, you name it. The list is endless. And so within the United States, depending on the region, you're going to have sub practices. But, for a while, until the creation of the Federal Reserve, you can almost say that the governing principle was freedom. And so, whatever was the most cost effective behaviors in order to bring about a good life, where you have food, shelter, and clothing, whatever, practices, behaviors would ensure an easy process to get those basic three things that forms the culture. And so, but the basic underlying principle is the freedom with responsibility. And then all of these other things are just simply tweaks or spins or accents, depending on the region, which is also dependent on who first settled there, right? And so then you have that it's not the same as the old world, it's different because of freedom. And because of all of these other changes that are happening, this increased standard of living, then it became a lot easier to forget the old ways. You can begin to see some of this confusion too. It leaks out in discussions of, like, say, white privilege. So when you talk about white privilege, and episode 13, this was before my old microphone, if you ever wanted to listen to that. So I talk about white privilege. It's just the skin color, right? It's the privilege or perks, that unearned advantage that some people feel, right, when it comes to your skin color. Okay. But whiteness itself, is formed through a diversity of cultures, ethnicities, values, diets, genetics, etc. Even people who write about white privilege, excuse me, like Peggy McIntosh and people like that, they don't get it either. They can't explain whiteness, right? In fact, the excerpt that I included in my book, was basically a panel discussion, and a caller called in and said, "Hey, can someone explain whiteness?" And they all laughed, right? Instead of answering the question, they just all laughed. So people still have a hard time defining white. And the story I gave in episode 13 was, I once had a student, she was white, blonde hair, blue eyed, but I knew she came late to the semester because she was an athlete coming from a different country, and I knew the country she was from. It was Georgia, right, on the south side of Russia. And I knew what she would say, so I asked her. I said, "Hey, so how do you self-identify?" And she said, "I'm Asian, duh." You know, which everyone in the class, there was 150 students in there. They were like, what? Blonde Asian? What? And this was before Asians were dyeing their hair blonde. So it was kind of interesting, right? All the reactions and whatnot. So skin color is the only thing that all whites, so-called, have in common. And so you're going to have lots of deviants from the norm, failures who don't live up to the whiteness expectation, right? But most people who talk about whiteness, you're going to ignore all of those outliers in order to preserve the stereotype. And so now you're going to engage in reductionism or essentialism, or just basically straight up racist assumptions. And racism for me is, uh, you know, you're going to identify someone by their single characteristic, by their single racialization. You're going to have expectations based on that single racialization, regardless of all the other characteristics that person has. And then you're going to treat them in a certain way based on that racialization, your preconceived understanding of who they are. And so we come back to it, right? So what is it, this thing that so many people hate so much? It's freedom, freedom to be who you are. and leaving other people alone, right? Believe what you want to believe, associate with whoever you want to associate with, marry who you want to marry, but you got to take responsibility, right? And if you're happy with your choices, then I don't care what you're, right? If I'm happy with my choices, I don't care what you're doing because I know I'm happy. And that's the freedom principle. So interestingly, in with that as the basis of life in America, the counterculture is to blame, right? Project blame onto other people, shift responsibility, right? And this is what happens in a culture of decline, right? A declining society, a society on the brink of collapse. This is what we begin to see. People don't care about freedom anymore. They just try to figure out who's going to pay for their lifestyle and who's responsible for all the bad that's happening in their lives. Hopefully, as we move forward, we will be able to remember our roots of freedom sooner than later, I hope. And that's it for this episode. I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.